On a visit to Jerusalem, America's vice president vowed ironclad support for Israel's security, reassuring Prime Minister Netanyahu that Washington had his back. He hoped the support could encourage the Jewish state to move ahead with the peace process. But Israel's government announced quite a different course of action, declaring 1,600 new housing units for Jewish people in occupied East Jerusalem. Frustrated, the vice president condemned the move as precisely the kind of step that undermines the trust we need right now. Mr. Netanyahu rushed to say that the plan had been announced by his right-wing coalition partners, not him. Though Mr. Netanyahu supports settlement of East Jerusalem, he did not want to jeopardize relations with the US by being seen as disrupting any peace process. Yet the vice president said the move runs counter to constructive discussions he'd had. It was March 2010, and then Vice President Joe Biden ended his trip to Israel frustrated and embarrassed.
Look, if it was a political stunt, it was a very stupid political stunt, and I personally take some insult to it. The West Bank is not going to be annexed by Israel.
On Wednesday, during U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance's visit to Israel, Israel's Knesset voted to approve a bill applying Jewish sovereignty to the occupied West Bank. The move was supported by several right-wing members of Netanyahu's governing coalition, as well as members of the political opposition. There is little new about the vote. The ruling Likud Party's charter states that there will only be Israeli sovereignty from the river to the sea, and Israel's parliament had already voted for a motion calling to annex the West Bank in July of this year by a wide margin of 71 to 13. Given the Israeli military's de facto control over the West Bank, the vote was more symbolic than impactful, coming in the context of US President Trump's recently unveiled peace plan for Gaza. The plan had dashed right-wing ambitions to annex Gaza, which had grown throughout the two-year war in the Strip. For them, the vote was a chance to show that Israel would not unquestioningly follow US policy, and instead argue that now was the time to accelerate settlement of the occupied West Bank. At the same time, Netanyahu's political rivals saw a chance to embarrass the current government, accused, not for the first time, of being a client or vassal state of the US after agreeing to Trump's ceasefire deal in Gaza. Trump had reportedly promised Arab and Muslim leaders while at the UN General Assembly that he would not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. Regional backlash from powerful states like Saudi Arabia has historically been seen as potential leverage over Israel's actions. But recent statements by Israeli ministers have cast doubt on that idea.
אם סעודיה אומרת לנו נורמליזציה בתמורה למדינה פלסטינית, חברים, לא תודה, תמשיכו לרכב על גמלים על החול במדבר בסעודיה, אנחנו נמשיך להתפתח באמת עם כלכלה וחברה ומדינה ואת כל הדברים הגדולים והנהדרים שאנחנו יודעים לעשות.
Jewish settlement of occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank has advanced under every Israeli government since 1967. But Israel's current government entered office in late 2022, and then the Hamas-led attacks of 7th of October 2023 have both caused settlement expansion and settler violence to skyrocket. In the past 3 years, Israel's government has advanced 22 new settlements, 48,000 new housing units, and designated 6,400 acres of land as state property, nearly matching the total number of acres declared during the last 27 years combined. At the same time, control over the occupied West Bank has been transferred from the military to officials appointed by Israel's senior minister Bezalel Smotrich under his new civil administration, allowing even more leeway to execute these policies and challenging the military's traditional authority. This move has emboldened some settlers who have taken the initiative to illegally settle even more occupied Palestinian land. Since early 2023, these settlers have built more than 130 outposts in the West Bank. Outposts are not officially sanctioned by Israel's government, but Israeli officials more often than not turn a blind eye before later approving them in retrospect. Alongside this illegal construction, settler violence has reached record levels, with an average of 130 assaults per month in the first half of this year. Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has distributed 100,000 gun licenses in the past 2 years, meaning many of those settlers carry firearms. Wearing reservist uniforms, some are indistinguishable from Israeli soldiers to local Palestinians. The violence committed by settlers includes destroying livestock, setting fire to farmland and property, damaging water and electricity lines, breaking into homes, and threatening the Palestinians living there to leave or be killed. These attacks, along with regular military raids and movement restrictions, is part of the reason why 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, and over 3,000 have been displaced since the 7th of October attacks in 2023. Given many Palestinians rely on agriculture for their livelihood, these attacks make it all but impossible to earn a living. Combined with the loss of job permits to work in Israel, regular road closures, and movement restrictions, unemployment rates in the West Bank have soared as high as 30% throughout the war, as opposed to around 12% beforehand. Diplomatic initiatives to recognize a Palestinian state have done little to change this reality. In some ways, they've accelerated it. For instance, Israel's government responded to declarations of Palestinian statehood by announcing the E1 settlement, a development that would cut the northern West Bank from the south and so make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible.
The West Bank is, don't worry about the West Bank. Israel's not going to do anything with the West Bank, okay? Don't worry about it. Is that your question? They're not going to do anything with the West Bank. Don't worry about it.
While American and Israeli officials trade comments over annexing or not annexing the West Bank, events on the ground are unfolding at pace. Through the seizure of land, the construction or expansion of new settlements cutting off different parts of the West Bank, and the use of widespread violence to intimidate local Palestinians into fleeing. Palestinians and rights groups have warned time and time again that the violence has reached unprecedented and unbearable levels, so much so that even Israel's military has clashed with settler activists over fears of full-scale fighting in the West Bank. Yet rather than heeding the military's warnings and disciplining such violence, senior government ministers have often used rhetoric that encourages it. Today, we'll hear from 3 voices who will tell us more about the impact of this. Abed Shehadeh will tell us about how settlement expansion is impacting Palestinians on the ground. Meron Rapoport will tell us about how Israelis see the occupation. And lastly, Peter Oborn will tell us about what, if anything, the world can do. Firstly, we'll hear from Abed Shehadeh. Hi, Abed. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you for having me. I very much appreciate the Middle East Eye. So anytime Middle East Eye needs me, I'm there.
Thank you so much. So I just want to start off by asking, we heard this announcement of a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, even though strikes haven't completely stopped. I want to ask, though, the violence in the occupied West Bank seems at an all-time high. Why is that if supposedly there's now a peace plan in motion?
First off, we need to go back to 2017. And I think it's absolutely, it's astonishing that how honest the Israeli policymakers are and how international community tends to ignore what they say. 2017, Bezalel Smotrich, he published a plan called the Decisive Plan. And I think we can't understand settler violence today without understanding what Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, said in 2017. And I think when we talk about settler violence, we need to see it in 2 ways. The first is the physical violence that we see through social media networks and so on. But on the other hand, there's also the institutional violence, and they go hand in hand. So for those who don't know, the Decisive Plan that was published in 2017, it's a step-by-step plan how Israel should annex the West Bank. And what Bezalel Smotrich, especially in this government, did in recent years is exactly this. And what's important about it, it's other than the annexation part, there's an institutional element to it, which takes power from the Israeli military, because under the occupation law and international law, it's the military that should govern the people. And slowly but gradually, he's moving it to a civil administration. And all the policing aspect is moving to the Israeli police, which is run by his party member, Ben Gvir. So there is this master plan of annexing the West Bank, and anything that has to do with policing the settlements, the settlers, stopping violence, something the military used to do, fear of international law, because under international law, Israel is not allowed to allow any civil administration to run the policing in the occupied territories. But now the police is having more and more power. There's more civil administration in the West Bank. And we have to add to it also the ideological right-wing shift in all of these institutions that are just allowing settlers to do what they want. These ideas that advocating for violence against Palestinians, burning houses, programs, and so on, they've always been there. But now they've unleashed the administration, and it's the institutions themselves. It's not only the ideology that is allowing them to do what they're doing.
And so you've described very well how the institutions really lay the infrastructure for this violence on the ground. I wonder then, when you see these shifts happening in real time, do you see that as part of a product of general public opinion, a general societal shift? Do you see them as, the product of kind of a green light by the US? How do you see this unfolding so clearly and easily when we have a US president saying, no, Israel won't annex the West Bank, and that's not going to happen, despite what you're describing?
And I think the Israeli public in general doesn't really care or listen to what the American administration says. So if we divide the Israeli public into two parts, the left, center, secular part, they don't see Palestinians. At best, they might see them as a cheap labor force, but they don't ask the question concerning human lives or Palestinian lives or Palestinian rights in the West Bank and how legal or not their action is in the West Bank. And most of them also join the military and take part in the occupation. But the other side, the other part, the settlers, the ideologicals, I think we've seen it in the past 2 years of the genocide in Gaza. They're just messianic. There isn't no... I think we can't understand the Israeli messianic right ideology with rational tools. And if you look on their policies with Masjid al-Aqsa, for example, and if you look at what they're trying to do and how they're trying to pray more and more in Masjid al-Aqsa and advocating for building the third temple. And
just to clarify for our listeners, you're talking about Al-Aqsa Mosque complex in Jerusalem.
The White House asked a question to the White House concerning the building the third temple. I think they're serious. And I think they use violence as a tool to intimidate Palestinians. If you visit the West Bank, this is interesting. You'll find graffiti all over the West Bank in Arabic, written by the Israeli settlers and soldiers, saying Palestinians don't have future in Palestine. Interesting enough, the first time they recognize Palestinians even exist, but it's an ongoing project to put pressure on the Palestinians on the day-to-day life, more checkpoints. There was a Palestinian who said something very interesting. Every time we see any action taken by the American administration of Palestine, Israel immediately builds more checkpoints, and settlers attack more and more Palestinians. So I don't think they really care about what the American administration says. And I think they're serious about their project. They're not rational, and I think it's very, very dangerous.
I wonder then what the impact of this has been. As you say, there is this group of religiously minded Messianic settlers who have been quite consistently using violence as a tool on the ground. We've seen in the past couple years since October 7th, 3,000 Palestinians displaced, many Bedouin communities displaced, particularly in the areas in Area C, towards the south of the West Bank, near Hebron. I wonder, do you think the result then is that this policy, whether from Smotrich, whether from settlers on the ground, do you think it's working then? Do you think that this displacement will only increase without a real end to the violence in sight?
And first of all, I'm going to say two things that might sound contradicting, but I think they portray a much more complicated reality. We are seeing in recent years more and more Palestinians seeking refuge in other states. It's a phenomenon, and it's happening in the West Bank. But on the other hand, we're seeing that there's something interesting, especially in the communities you just mentioned, the Bedouins and Falahic communities in Area C, which is the majority of the West Bank is Area C. This is where most of the settlement attacks happen against the Palestinian villages. We're seeing grassroots activism and more communities coming together to push back, and they try in many ways to survive. And I think history has taught Palestinians since 1948, throughout the past almost 80 years, that as soon as the Palestinians leave, they won't be allowed to come back. And I think the Palestinians in the Palestinian villages in Area C understand this very well, and they're putting on a fight. And I think it's also good for us to remember that there are people who are fighting for their land, for their villages, for their houses. So I don't think the Israelis will succeed in the long run. And I think we should appreciate more and more all the people who are fighting for surviving, for staying on their land, and against all of these policies. And the other part is, and Israelis are talking about this more and more, these policies that are pushed by Bezalel Smotrich and the other right-wing Israeli ministers and parliament members, is pushing for a wider resistance, and they understand that putting so much pressure on people, at the end of the day, it's not a good idea. But again, I think these are very, very dangerous people, both in the Israeli ministry, whether it's Bezalel Smotrich or other political figures. But unfortunately, we're seeing also more and more extremely right-wing messianic, whether it's in the military or whether it's in the police force, that are leading the Israeli institutions. And I think it's a recipe for disaster. And for the long run, I don't think Palestinians will disappear. I think the Palestinians will put up a fight.
As you say, there have been obviously fantasies of annexation and mass displacement of the Palestinians, but those have met resistance, as you've said, from groups on the ground. I wonder, you see this not just as an ideological shift, but an institutional takeover, right? And the mechanisms of Israel's state increasingly being directed towards this purpose. So I wonder then, do you see that vision ultimately prevailing, given that it's not just contained in a person or a few person, but it's starting to define the state structures of Israel? In that case, do you see that vision as, potentially resulting in, for example, an intensification of these policies, potential, as you said, something that could really flare up into full-scale violence in the West Bank between Israelis and Palestinians? Do you think that will go unchecked and perhaps lead to, an explosion of fighting?
Well, first off, I think the Israeli right-wing nationalists, they've succeeded, and they've succeeded in the discourse. And I suggest people to follow up on how the Israeli left speak and what kind of discourse they use. You understand that they're using discourse that was being used by the Israeli right-wing nationalists in the 90s. And they worked in two ways. They worked in classic politics, running for a parliament and so on. But in the 90s, they took a very important decision, especially after the Oslo Accords, of infiltrating the Israeli institutions, of running for administrative office. Now, if you go through the Israeli ministries, all ministries, whether it's the education ministry, whether it's the health ministry, whether it's the municipalities, they're everywhere. And I think they've managed. And for the people who don't know, in the 90s, when a very racist political figure and influential figure called Meir Kahane, when he was elected to the Knesset in the 90s, parliament members from the Likud, they left the building when he was anointed to office. So this just shows us the shift that happened, that people today from the Likud speak like Meir Kahane, who advocate for transfer of the Palestinians. And at the end of the day, I don't think I don't see anything or anyone from the Israeli, whether it's political parties or whether it's from grassroots activism, so on, is even willing to challenge. I'm talking in the mainstream, obviously, is willing to challenge these notions that the Israeli right national pushed for in the 90s. And I think today it's up for the Palestinians. But I'll end with what I started. I don't think anyone should underestimate what Bezalel Smotrich says or any of these figures, because they're very serious about them and they work for the long run. And if anyone wants to know what's their next plan, it's already written down. You can read the decisive plan. It's published. You can find it on Google, where Bezalel Smotrich says it step by step how he is planning to annex the West Bank, steps that we are seeing them today as we speak.
A very dark and ominous warning there, but I think we would all do well to pay attention to, given the current circumstances. Abed Shehadeh, thank you so much for offering your perspective on Middle East Eye today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, giving us the perspective from within Israel, we have Israeli journalist and analyst Meron Rapoport here to tell us about how Israelis are looking at the occupation and potential annexation of the West Bank. Hi, Meron. How are you? Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, how are you?
I just want to ask you, we're obviously at a critical moment, a ceasefire deal supposedly underway after 2 years of war. I want to ask what lessons you feel Israeli society has drawn, both from the 7th of October attacks and 2 years of war, how you think it's changed their views on occupation, on potential peace with the Palestinians across the political spectrum.
Well, I think it's a little bit too early, but it's quite obvious that the views vis-a-vis Palestinian state, there's less support than before, not dramatically, less dramatically that maybe it could have one could imagine, but certainly there is a decrease in the support for the two-state solution. There is general feeling that that the lesson, this is what the media is trying to portray, that the lesson from October 7 is that you cannot count on Palestinians in any case, that all they want is to kill Israelis. So I would say that is one, I would say, lesson, or at least it's not so dramatic. It was before, but maybe it is more felt. On the other hand, I think there is a certain fatigue in the Israeli society from the continuation of the war. Beginning from the mid 24, there was a majority in all opinion polls for release of all hostages in return to the end of the war. So there was a majority for the end of the war. It's true, it had nothing to do with the suffering of the people in Gaza. It had nothing to do with humanitarian issues. It was almost solely for releasing the hostages. But at the same time, the words were stop the war. And I think it showed a certain fatigue in Israel from the continuation of the war, from the fact that we are in continued war, that Netanyahu is proposing almost an eternal war before the ceasefire. there were talks that the war in Gaza will continue for 6 or 7 years. So I think there is some kind of fatigue there in Israel.
I wonder if that fatigue extends to the policies of Netanyahu's government in general. So I don't know how much you may hear this, but do you get the sense that even though across the board there's very little support for Palestinian statehood, as you note yourself, the kind of lesson taken is that, well, we have no partners in peace and we can't trust the Palestinians. But I wonder, do Israelis feel that Netanyahu's government is acting in the best interest of national security? Because we've seen accusations against some senior ministers that actually they're doing more to compromise Israel's security rather than to protect it, which is quite an accusation. So I wonder what you hear in Israeli public opinion.
I think that generally speaking, and it's not also the opinion polls and also my impression is that many Israelis, I would say at least more than half of the Israelis, maybe much more, maybe around 60 or 70%, but I think more than 50% of the Israelis feel that Netanyahu's government and his minister did not act for the sake of Israel, and that they jeopardized the interest of Israel by prolonging the war, by preventing a deal to release the hostages, by also having all these dreams about settling in Gaza, which is not very popular among the wider public. And they don't they have minimal confidence in Netanyahu. Netanyahu was called a murderer on on the stage in demonstration in which hundreds of thousands of Israelis participated. He was called a murderer by Israelis, not by Palestinians, not by anti-Zionists, by Israelis. He was called a murderer by families of the hostages. So I think there's very little confidence in Netanyahu. At the same time, unfortunately, the idea that Netanyahu sells the public, and that without saying that in so many words, that we should return to October 6th. We should return to the status quo before the war, a situation in which Israel is controlling Gaza, Israel decides what enters Gaza and what not, it controls the humanitarian aid, of course, it attacks wherever it wants in Gaza, that there is some kind of a status quo in which even Hamas stays in power, as was the case before October 7th.
I wonder then that philosophy of containing things, of the status quo, of, we can remain in control just so long as we mow the lawn every so often. Does that extend even to the occupied West Bank? Because obviously we've seen incredible settler violence there, incredible settlement expansion, and violence seems at an all-time high. Is there still the same understanding that if we just contain and manage the situation, then nothing really needs to change? Do Israelis perceive that status quo as sustainable?
Unfortunately, I think most Israelis, of course, the settlers have their plan and they do what they do. And we see the results every day, every night in the West Bank, in attacks in the West Bank, and of course in building new settlements and new outposts. But I think the majority of Israelis don't pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the West Bank. This is similar to what happened regarding Gaza before the war. Israelis did not pay attention to the fact that 2 million people in Gaza are under siege for 16 years. They didn't pay attention to that. They didn't think about it. And then it blew up in their faces. So they don't really see most Israelis, I'm not talking about the settlers, but most Israelis just don't see what's happening in the West Bank. They don't really care about these attacks. They don't really care about all these things. And unfortunately, I think most Israelis still believe that we can contain the situation, that now we have won over Hezbollah, we have won over Iran. I doubt certainly the second assumption, that we have won over Hamas, and we can contain the situation. I think, unfortunately, there's no real proposal coming from the Israeli left or strong enough. There is a proposal, but it's very weak, saying, no, we should change things. We should now go and start a negotiation with the Palestinian on a Palestinian state on the end of the conflict. I think, unfortunately, this is a very small minority among Israelis.
I wonder then, we often hear that Israeli society is very polarized, that there are two different visions of Israel. You know, one is this super Sparta and the other is this more globalist, diplomatically accepted, regionally integrated Israel. And yet, as you say, I only see kind of a powerful political advocate for one vision, the prior vision. I don't see any real political opposition to just a continuation of the status quo. And as you said, there don't seem to be strong feelings or attention to the occupied West Bank. I wonder then, conscious of the fact that Israel is due to hold elections within a year from now, what vision, if any, could replace the current one? And if Prime Minister Netanyahu were to be replaced, would it be by someone further to his right rather than, as you say, a very weakened and divided or discredited left?
I think if Netanyahu is replaced, it will be someone who is a little bit to the center, more to the center. I think so. And certainly if he himself, and we're talking about Naftali Bennett, ex-prime minister, as the main candidate now to replace Netanyahu, he's right wing, but his coalition will include centrist and even center left parties. So I think the next coalition will be more leftist, if you can say so. But a real vision is lacking. But, and this is a big but here, I think that the fact that the conflict has become international, that we are talking about international forces in Gaza, and international intervention in Gaza, and international attention, huge international attention to Gaza and the Palestinian case in general. I think this may change things, and the automatic support that we have seen from the previous American administration may be withdrawing a little bit with Trump, and the people around it are very affiliated with Qatar and with Turkey. And this could influence also the internal political scene in Israel.
So that pressure for any bold step certainly to come from outside rather than within Israel in terms of thinking outside the box. That, I suppose, provides some hope for a political future. Meron Rapoport, Israeli analyst and journalist, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today.
Thank you.